My name is Dale Kessler, and I was 3 days out of a triple bypass, still hooked to a heart monitor in a hospital room in Rapid City, when my brother Wade signed the papers that sold the last 420 acres of our father's farm for $260,000 less than it was worth, and didn't tell me until the check had already cleared. I found out from a text message, not a phone call. A text from a number I didn't recognize that read, "Sorry for your loss on the Kessler place. Hell of a deal your brother gave me. Anytime you want to see what I'm doing with the North 40, come on by." It was signed Kurt Neubauer, a man I'd known since we were both 19 years old bidding against each other at the same grain elevator. A man who had wanted that land under our fence line since before our father died. I read that text twice, lying in a hospital bed with a tube still taped to the back of my hand, and I remember thinking with a strange and total calm that I already knew, before I called anyone to confirm it, exactly what had happened. I need to back up, because none of this makes sense unless you understand what that land actually was. My father, Arlen Kessler, homesteaded 800 acres outside Phillips, South Dakota in 1961, on a loan from a bank that folded twice over the decades, and land he cleared himself with a tractor that broke down more than it ran. He married my mother Ruth in 1963, and the two of them raised Wade and me in a farmhouse, with no air conditioning and a wood stove. That was the only thing standing between us and a Dakota winter for the first 15 years of my life. I was the older brother by 3 years, and from the time I was old enough to walk a fence line, my father had me out there beside him, checking wire, moving cattle, learning the particular silence of a man who says almost nothing but means every single word he does say. Wade was different from the start, and I don't say that with any bitterness, only as a fact the way you'd describe weather. He was restless in a way our father never understood, quick with people, quick with a joke, the kind of boy who could sell a broken tractor to the man who just fixed it and have him thank you on the way out. He left for Sioux Falls the week after high school graduation, worked in insurance sales for almost 30 years, built a life 200 miles from the dirt he grew up on, and came back to visit maybe twice a year, holidays mostly, always leaving a day earlier than he'd originally planned. I stayed. I married my wife Carol, out of Phillip High School the same year Wade left, and the two of us moved into the old house when my parents built a smaller place down the road. And I spent the next 34 years doing exactly what my father had done before me, which is to say, everything a farm actually requires that nobody outside of it ever sees. I want to be honest that I loved it, the actual work of it, not in some sentimental magazine way, but the way you love something that has worn you down and built you up in equal measure for your whole adult life. My father passed 11 years ago, a stroke in the barn on a Tuesday morning, found by our hired hand around noon. My mother had passed 6 years before that, and by the time Dad went, the will he'd had drawn up split the 800 acres between Wade and me evenly, 400 each, though everyone in that county, including Wade himself, understood that the arrangement he actually wanted was for me to keep working the whole operation, paying Wade a fair annual lease on his half, since Wade had no interest in farming and never had. That arrangement held for 11 years. I farmed all 800 acres, split with Wade a portion of the proceeds every fall that Carol and I calculated down to the dollar, sent him a check and a letter every October, the same way I'd send it to a business partner, because that's exactly what he was, even if he'd never once in 11 years driven out to see how his half of the ground was actually doing. I had a small warm ritual that I want to mention here because it matters to how the rest of this went. Every morning before sunrise, before Carol was even awake, I'd drive the truck out to the eastern fence line with my granddaughter Josie's old dog, a blue heeler named Scout that Josie had left with us when she went off to college, and I'd sit on the tailgate with a thermos of coffee and watch the sun come up over ground my father had cleared with his own hands. I did that 7 days a week for 11 years, rain or frost, or nothing at all happening that morning worth watching. It wasn't for anybody but me. It was just the one part of the day that belonged entirely to me before it belonged to anybody else. Carol and I raised 2 daughters in that house, Angela and Renee, both gone now to lives of their own in Sioux Falls and Minneapolis, both of them coming home for Christmas and the occasional summer week, but neither one of them wanting the farm any more than Wade had ever wanted it. Josie, Angela's oldest, was the one exception in the whole family, the one grandchild who actually loved the ground the way I loved it, who spent every summer of her childhood out here instead of at some camp or another, who could tell you the difference between a heifer ready to calve and one that wasn't before she was 10 years old. She left the Blue Heeler, Scout, with us when she went off to college 2 years ago studying agricultural economics, half joking that she'd be back to run the place herself someday if I ever got tired of it, though we both understood that was still a long way off, or thought we did, before any of this happened. I want to explain something about the actual texture of the work, because it matters to understanding what Wade walked away from all those years ago, and what I never once resented him for walking away from, right up until the moment he took something that wasn't only his to take. Farming 800 acres of wheat and cattle country in that part of South Dakota means being up before 4 most mornings during calving season, means fixing your own equipment because the nearest mechanic is 40 minutes away and twice as expensive as just learning to do it yourself, means watching a hailstorm flatten half a wheat crop in 11 minutes and going back out the next morning anyway, because the cattle still need feeding regardless of what the sky did the night before. My father taught me all of it patiently, wordlessly mostly, the way men of his generation taught things, by letting me stand close enough to watch and correcting me, only when I got it wrong badly enough to matter. Carol worked the books and ran a small produce stand at the end of our drive for over 20 years, and between the two of us and whatever hired help we could afford in a given season, we kept that operation not just alive but genuinely healthy enough that Wade's half of the annual proceeds, the checks I sent him every October without fail, weren't some token gesture. Some years they ran past $40,000, real money for a man who never once had to touch a fence post or lose a night's sleep over a sick calf to earn it 6 months ago. My heart started acting up in a way I couldn't ignore any longer, a tightness in my chest during morning chores that sent me to the emergency room in Phillip. And from there, an ambulance ride to a cardiac unit in Rapid City, 120 miles away. The diagnosis came back fast and ugly. Triple vessel blockage, emergency bypass surgery, scheduled for 2 days out. No real choice in the matter if I wanted to see another harvest. Wade drove out for the surgery. I'll give him that much credit plainly. He sat in the waiting room with Carol for the 6 hours the surgery took, and when I came out of anesthesia, groggy and confused, he was the first face I saw besides my wife's, holding my hand and telling me everything had gone fine. The surgeon said so himself. "You scared the hell out of all of us," he said, and I remember believing, in that moment, that whatever distance had grown between us over 3 decades of him living in Sioux Falls and me staying on the ground, some of it had genuinely closed in that hospital room. I was 3 days into recovery, still hooked to monitors, still moving like an old man 20 years past his actual age, when that text came through from Kurt Neubauer. I called Carol into the room and handed her my phone without a word, because I couldn't yet trust my own voice to ask the question out loud. She read it, went pale, and sat down slowly in the chair beside my bed. "Dale, that doesn't make sense. Wade wouldn't sell without talking to you first. Call him," I said. "Right now." Wade picked up on the 4th ring, and I could hear, even before he said a word, the particular careful tone of a man who's been waiting for a phone call he'd rather not receive. "Hey, Dale, how you feeling? Recovery going okay?" "Kurt Neubauer just texted me," I said. "Said he bought the North 40. Said you gave him a hell of a deal." There was a silence on the line that told me everything before Wade said a single word to confirm it. "I was going to tell you," he said, "once you were further along, once the doctor cleared you for stress. I didn't want to hit you with business stuff while you were still in a hospital bed. You sold 400 acres of Dad's ground, my ground, without one phone call. It's my 400 acres, Dale, legally. It's always been mine to do what I want with." That's when the tightness came back into my chest, and Carol says my monitor started beeping loud enough that a nurse came running, and I had to hand the phone to my wife because I genuinely could not finish that conversation without doing damage to a heart that had just been cut open 3 days before. I want to explain, before I go further, exactly what that North 40 meant, because a piece of paper will tell you it was worth a certain number of dollars, and that number will never come close to telling you the truth of it. That 40 acres held the original homestead, well my father dug by hand in 1962, the one that never ran dry even in the drought years that emptied every other well for 10 miles around. It held the small grove of cottonwoods my mother planted the year Wade was born. Trees that were 60 feet tall now, the only real shade for half a mile in any direction. It held the exact spot, marked by nothing but a flat gray stone my father set there himself, where we'd scattered both my parents' ashes, together 6 years apart, because neither one of them wanted a cemetery plot in town when they had 800 acres of ground that was already theirs in every way that mattered. And it held the fence line, where I sat every single morning with a thermos of coffee and Josie's blue healer, watching the sun come up over the one part of my day that belonged only to me. Kurt Neubauer had wanted that specific 40 acres for over 15 years, ever since a boundary dispute back when we were both still relatively young men trying to figure out where our father's fence lines actually sat, versus where the county plat maps said they sat. My father had won that dispute, fair and documented, and Kurt never fully let it go, the way certain men in farm country never let go of a piece of ground they believe should have been theirs. Once I was steady enough to leave the hospital, 9 days after the surgery, weaker than I'd ever been in my adult life, I asked Carol to drive me straight to the county recorder's office in Phillip instead of home, because I needed to see the actual paperwork with my own eyes before I could believe any of it. The deed transfer was dated 11 days before my surgery. Wade had known, sitting in that hospital room, holding my hand and telling me everything went fine, that he'd already sold the ground 3 weeks prior. He hadn't decided to sell while I was recovering. He'd already closed the deal before I was even wheeled into the operating room, and then sat beside my bed afterwards saying nothing about it at all. The sale price on the recorded deed was $418,000 for 40 acres that included a producing well, mature timber, and frontage on the county road, ground that any honest appraisal in that market would have put closer to $680,000. Kurt Neubauer hadn't just gotten a deal. He'd gotten a gift, and Wade had handed it to him at a moment when I was strapped to a hospital bed and physically incapable of doing a single thing about it. I sat in the truck outside that recorder's office for a long time before I trusted myself to drive, Carol's hand on my arm, neither one of us saying much of anything, because there wasn't much to say yet that wouldn't have made my blood pressure worse than it already was. The following Sunday, Wade drove out to the farm, apparently under the impression that enough time had passed for things to have cooled down. He came alone, without his wife Diane, and found me sitting on the porch of the old house, still moving slow, still 6 weeks from being cleared for anything harder than walking. Figured we should talk this through in person, he said, standing at the bottom of the porch steps like a man unsure whether he was still welcome to climb them. Sit down, Wade. He sat, and for a moment neither one of us said anything, and I let that silence stretch out longer than was comfortable for either one of us, because I wanted him to be the one to break it. I know the timing looks bad, he finally said. The timing isn't the problem, Wade. The lying is the problem. I didn't lie to you. You sat in that hospital room and held my hand and told me everything was fine 3 weeks after you'd already signed that ground away. That's a lie by omission, and you know it, and I think some part of you knew it the whole time you were doing it. Wade looked out at the fence line, the same fence line I'd been sitting at every morning of my adult life, and for a moment I thought I saw something real cross his face before he covered it back over. I needed the money, Dale. Diane's medical bills from her surgery last year, my youngest gem tuition, some bad investments I made that I'm not proud of. I've got debts you don't know about, and that ground was the only asset I had that was worth anything close to what I needed. Then you call me. You tell me you're in trouble. You don't sell Dad's well, and Mom's cottonwoods behind my back while I'm laid up with my chest cracked open. You'd have talked me out of it. Damn right I would have, I said, and my voice came out louder than I'd meant it to. Loud enough that Carol came to the screen door to check on me. I'd have found another way. I'd have leased more ground, taken out a loan against my own half, done anything except let Kurt Neubauer walk away with the one piece of that farm that actually mattered. It's just dirt, Dale. I sat with that sentence for a long moment because I think it told me more about the last 30 years of distance between us than anything else he could have said. It was never just dirt to Dad, and it sure as hell wasn't just dirt to me. Carol had come out onto the porch partway through that conversation, standing near the screen door with her arms crossed, and Wade glanced at her more than once like a man hoping for an ally who wasn't going to give him one. Carol, you understand, don't you? He said at one point. I was in a bad spot. I understand you sat in a hospital waiting room for 6 hours, Carol said, her voice steady and cold in a way I'd rarely heard from her in 34 years of marriage, and then drove home and let your brother believe you were grieving alongside him over a scare that nearly killed him, when the whole time you already knew what you'd done. I don't think bad spot covers that, Wade. I think it's going to take you a good while to find the right words for what that actually was." Wade didn't answer her, and the silence that followed told me she'd landed harder than anything I'd said myself. Wade left that afternoon without either one of us reaching anything close to resolution, and the weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my recovery, harder in some ways than the surgery itself, because grief with a clear shape is something a body can eventually process, and this didn't have a clear shape at all. It was betrayal wearing the face of my own brother, and I didn't know yet what to do with a wound like that. I called a lawyer the following week, a woman named Bonnie Halverson, who'd handled agricultural estate disputes across 3 counties for over 20 years, recommended to me by our longtime accountant. I sat in her office in Pierre with the recorded deed, and my father's original will spread out on the desk between us, still moving carefully, still 6 weeks from full clearance from my cardiologist. "Walk me through the actual ownership structure," she said, and I did, the 50-50 split, the informal lease arrangement, 11 years of annual payments I could document down to the dollar. "Here's the hard truth of it, Dale," Bonnie said, once she'd reviewed everything. "Wade's half was legally his to sell. Your father's will gave you each an undivided half interest, and nothing in that document required either of you to get the other's consent before selling your own share. Morally, what he did to you is about as low as it gets. Legally, he was within his rights, so there's nothing I can do." "I didn't say that," Bonnie said. "There's a difference between what he was allowed to do and how he did it. Depending on how that sale was structured, and depending on what Kurt Neubauer knew about the timing, there may be grounds to argue the transaction was structured specifically to avoid your input while you were medically incapacitated, which matters more than you'd think if this ever needs to go further than a family conversation. But before we go there, Dale, I want you to hear me say something plainly, because I've watched enough families tear themselves apart over land to know how this usually ends. Go ahead. The question you actually need to answer isn't whether you can punish Wade legally. It's whether you want a relationship with your brother more than you want to win this fight. Those two things aren't always compatible, and you need to decide, clearly, before you go any further, which one matters more to you. I didn't have an answer for her that day, and I told her so honestly. And she nodded like she'd expected exactly that answer from a man 3 months into heart surgery recovery who'd just learned his brothers sold their father's well out from under him. What followed over the next several months was a slow, ugly unraveling of exactly how deep this went, each piece worse than the one before it. The first thing I learned, about 3 weeks after that porch conversation, came from our accountant, a steady man named Gerald Pruitt, who'd handled the farm's books for over 20 years. Gerald called me on a Thursday evening, his voice careful in the particular way of a man about to deliver news he knows will land hard. "Dale, I need to tell you something, and I want you to hear all of it before you react. Wade called me back in February, 4 months before your surgery, asking me to run some numbers on what his half of the operation was worth if he sold outright versus continuing the lease arrangement. February, I said slowly. That's 5 months before he actually sold. He'd been thinking about it a lot longer than any of us realized, Dale. I told him at the time I thought it was a mistake, that the lease income was steady and the land would keep appreciating, but he said his situation had gotten urgent enough that he couldn't wait on appreciation. That was the first real crack in the story Wade had told me on the porch, that this had been some sudden decision born of panic. He'd been planning it for 5 months, quietly, while I sent him his lease check every October like clockwork, never once telling me any of it was coming. The second piece came a month later, and it was worse. Carol had been going through some old mail that had piled up during my hospital stay and recovery, and she found a certified letter, opened and then apparently hidden in a drawer in the mudroom, dated 3 weeks before my surgery. It was from Kurt Neubauer's attorney, confirming the terms of the sale, and specifically noting, in careful legal language, that the closing had been scheduled to occur, quote, prior to any anticipated medical procedures affecting the co-owner Dale Kessler, in order to finalize the transaction without complication. I sat at my kitchen table with that letter for a long time, my hands shaking in a way that had nothing to do with my heart condition. Wade hadn't just failed to tell me before my surgery. He and Kurt Neubauer had specifically timed the closing to happen before I went under the knife, so that whatever objection I might have raised would arrive too late to stop anything, and so that I'd be recovering from major surgery, disoriented and weak, at the exact moment the news would land. I called Bonnie Halverson the next morning and read her the letter over the phone. That changes things considerably, she said. That's not just poor judgment anymore, Dale. That's a documented, deliberate effort to structure a transaction around your incapacitation. I want that letter in my file today. Josie called me from her dorm the week after I found that certified letter, having heard some garbled version of events from her mother, and her voice on the phone was angrier on my behalf than I think I'd allowed myself to be out loud yet. Grandpa, that's great-grandma's trees. That's the well great-grandpa dug himself. How do you sell that out from under someone in a hospital bed? I don't have a good answer for you, Joe. Are you going to be okay? Financially, I mean, not just the ground itself. We'll be fine, I told her, and it was true, because the 680 acres Wade couldn't touch were more than enough to keep the operation healthy. This was never really about the money for me. It's about what he let me believe while I was lying in that bed. I still want to run that place someday, she said quietly. For what it's worth, all of it, not just what's left. I know you do, I told her, and something about hearing her say it out loud, plain and unbothered by any of the mess Wade had made, steadied me more than I expected it to. The third piece came from an unexpected direction entirely. My granddaughter Josie, home from college for a long weekend, mentioned almost in passing that she'd run into Wade's daughter, my niece Britt, at a wedding shower back in June, and Britt had let slip that her father had been, quote, stressed about money for almost 2 years, not just recently, and that there'd been a serious conversation at a family dinner about whether Wade and Diane might need to sell their own house in Sioux Falls before Wade landed on the idea of selling his half of the farm instead. 2 years, I said, mostly to myself, sitting at the kitchen table across from Josie. He's been in trouble for 2 years and never said one word to me about any of it. Would you have helped him, Grandpa? I thought about that question longer than it probably needed, because the honest answer mattered more than the quick one. Yes, I finally said. Not blindly, not without understanding what got him there. But yes, I'd have found a way to help him that didn't require selling the one piece of ground that mattered most to this family. The fourth reveal, and the one that finally pushed me past anger into something colder, came directly from Kurt Neubauer himself, though not intentionally. I ran into him at the grain elevator in Phillip on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the same elevator where the two of us had bid against each other as 19-year-olds decades earlier, and he had the nerve, or maybe just the obliviousness, to bring it up himself. Dale, good to see you up and moving. Heard the surgery went well. It did, I said, keeping my voice level. Listen, no hard feelings on the land deal, I hope. Wade came to me, not the other way around. Told me straight out he needed to close before you were. And I'm quoting him here, in any condition to weigh in on it. I figured that was between the two of you, not my business to get in the middle of. Every word of that confirmed what the letter had already told me, but hearing it out loud, from the man who'd benefited from it, in the same flat matter-of-fact tone he'd used to discuss grain prices, settled something cold and permanent into my chest that no amount of anger afterward ever quite matched. He came to you, I repeated. Sure did, back in the spring sometime. Said the timing had to work a certain way, and honestly, Dale, I didn't ask too many questions past that. A deal's a deal. Did he say why the timing mattered so much? Kurt shrugged, the same easy shrug I remembered from him as a 19-year-old at that very elevator, the shrug of a man who had never once in his life let a scruple slow down a good price. Said something about you being stubborn about that particular piece. Said it'd go smoother all around if it was already settled before you had a chance to weigh in. I'll be honest, Dale, at the time I figured that was just Wade being Wade, always wanting things easy. Didn't occur to me you'd be laid up in surgery when it actually closed. Wish I'd known that part. Maybe. Would it have changed anything? He thought about that a beat longer than I expected him to, and then answered with the kind of honesty that men like Kurt only seem to manage when there's nothing left for them to lose by it. Probably not the price, no. Might have changed how I felt about it afterward, though. I nodded once, because there wasn't much use pressing a man like Kurt Neubauer any further, and I turned and walked back to my truck, leaving a sack of feed corn unpurchased on the counter behind me for the first time in longer than I could remember, because I simply couldn't stand in that building next to him 1 minute longer than I already had. I drove home from that elevator and sat in my truck in the driveway for almost 20 minutes before I trusted myself to go inside, because I understood now, fully and without any remaining doubt, that this hadn't been panic or poor judgment on Wade's part. It had been a plan built over months, executed with precision, timed specifically around the one window when I would be least able to stop it or even understand it was happening. The fifth reveal arrived through Diane herself, Wade's wife, who called Carol one evening, not knowing yet how much Carol and I already understood, and let slip during an otherwise ordinary conversation that Wade had transferred $85,000 of the sale, proceeds into a separate account within a week of the closing. Money Diane assumed was earmarked for the tuition and the medical bills, only to discover later, when she went looking for it herself, that most of it had already gone toward a lump sum payment on a private loan Wade had taken out against the failed energy investment, a loan neither Diane nor I had known existed until that moment. Carol relayed all of this to me quietly at our kitchen table that night, and I remember sitting there doing the math in my head, the $418,000 from the sale, the $85,000 moved within a week, and understanding that whatever story Wade had told himself to make this bearable, the actual shape of it had almost nothing to do with tuition or medical bills at all. The sixth and final reveal came almost by accident, 3 months into all of this, when Britt, my niece, called me directly, her voice unsteady, clearly having agonized over whether to make the call at all. "Uncle Dale, I need to tell you something, and Dad doesn't know I'm calling." "Go ahead, Britt. The tuition thing and the medical bills, those were real, but they weren't the whole reason. Dad put almost $60,000 into some investment 2 years ago that a guy from his old insurance office talked him into, some kind of energy fund that basically collapsed. He's been trying to cover that hole ever since, and he was too embarrassed to tell you, because he knew exactly what you'd think of him losing that kind of money on something reckless. So he sold Dad's ground to cover his own mistake, and let me believe it was medical bills and tuition. Those were part of it too," Britt said quietly. "But yeah, most of it was the investment." I sat with that for a long moment, feeling less anger in that instant than something closer to exhaustion, the particular tiredness of a man who has spent months peeling back one layer of a lie, only to find another one waiting underneath it. Bonnie had a framed photograph on her office wall from her first meeting with me of her own father's ranch outside Murdo, and she'd mentioned once that her family had gone through a version of this themselves. A piece of the home place sold off to an uncle, back in the 80s under circumstances that weren't quite as deliberate as mine, but left a similar scar behind. "I do this work now," she'd told me during that first visit, mostly because I watched my own family avoid an honest conversation about money until money turned into a weapon instead. The conversation you're avoiding is always cheaper than the lawsuit you'll need once you've avoided it long enough. I thought about that line more than once in the months that followed, because it seemed to explain, better than anything else, exactly what Wade had let happen to the two of us. Bonnie Halverson and I met again shortly after that call, and I laid out the full picture for her, the 5-month planning window, the certified letter timing the closing around my surgery, Kurt Neubauer's own confirmation, and now the investment loss Wade had been hiding for 2 years. "Here's where we actually stand," Bonnie said. "You have a strong case that the sale was structured in bad faith around your medical incapacitation, strong enough that I believe a court would take it seriously if you wanted to pursue damages or push for some kind of remedy against Wade's remaining assets. What you don't have, and what no court can give you, is that specific 40 acres back. Kurt Neubauer bought it in good faith on paper, cleared the title, and has already started running cattle on it. That ground isn't coming back into this family through a lawsuit. Then what's the point of pursuing anything?" "The point," Bonnie said, "is that you get to decide what accountability actually looks like here, rather than just absorbing what happened and calling it family business. That might mean a formal claim against Wade's share of any future farm proceeds. It might mean something smaller, some acknowledgement enforced through a legal agreement, instead of just an apology you might never fully believe. But Dale, I want to say this plainly, the same as I said it the first day you sat in my office. You need to decide what you actually want more, before we go any further. Justice on paper, or your brother, in whatever form he's still capable of being one to you. Those roads split here, and once you pick one, it's harder than you think to walk back to the other." I didn't answer her right away. I drove home instead, and that evening I did something I hadn't done in months. I drove out to the eastern fence line at sunset instead of sunrise, sat on the tailgate with Josie's blue heeler beside me, and looked out at the ground that was still mine, the 680 acres Wade hadn't been able to sell, and I thought about my father, and what he would have actually wanted out of any of this. I decided, sitting on that tailgate, that I didn't want a courtroom. I wanted my brother to understand, fully and without softening, exactly what he'd taken, and I wanted him to have to sit with that understanding without me making it easy for him to escape it through excuses about tuition or bad investments or timing that just happened to work out the way it did. I called Wade the next morning and asked him to meet me at the farm, alone, no lawyers, no wives, just the two of us on that same porch. He came, looking older than I remembered him looking even a few months earlier, and sat down across from me without either one of us saying anything for a long moment. "I know about the investment," I said finally. "I know about the 5 months of planning. I know about the letter that timed the closing around my surgery on purpose. I talked to Kurt myself. I talked to Britt. I know all of it now, Wade, every piece." He didn't try to deny any of it, and I think that more than anything else that day told me something had actually shifted in him. "I've been ashamed of that investment for 2 years," he said quietly. "Ashamed enough that I convinced myself selling that ground was somehow different from asking you for help. Like it was my own decision to make instead of a failure I needed to admit to my own brother. And once I decided to sell, some part of me knew you'd stop me if you found out in time, and instead of facing that, I let Kurt structure the timing so I wouldn't have to. You let me believe it was medical bills." "Some of it was," he said, "but you're right that I let you believe it was mostly that, because the truth felt worse. Diane doesn't even fully know how much of that investment loss is behind this, Dale. I've been lying to more people than just you. That land had Mom's cottonwoods on it, Wade. Dad's well, the spot where we scattered both their ashes." His face changed at that, something breaking open that I hadn't seen in him since our father's funeral 11 years earlier. "I know," he said, his voice cracking. "I've known since the day I signed those papers, and I told myself I'd deal with what that meant later. And later just kept getting pushed further away because I couldn't stand to actually look at what I'd done. I'm not going to pretend this is fixed," I told him plainly. "I'm not going to pretend I trust you the way I used to, not for a long while yet, maybe not ever completely. But I need you to understand something, and I need you to actually hear it, instead of just waiting for me to finish talking. What hurt worse than losing that ground was you letting me believe you were sitting beside my hospital bed out of love, when the whole time, you already knew what you'd done, and you let me hold your hand thinking otherwise." Wade was quiet for a long time after that, and when he finally spoke, his voice was smaller than I'd heard it in years. "I don't know how to give that ground back to you, Dale. I don't know how to give you back the version of that hospital room where I wasn't already lying to you. I just know I'd give almost anything to be able to." "Then start with the truth from here forward," I said. "That's the only thing I actually want from you that's still possible to give." We didn't resolve everything that afternoon, not by a long distance, and I want to be honest about that instead of tying this up neater than it actually was. Bonnie Halverson and I did eventually reach a formal agreement with Wade, not a lawsuit, but a binding arrangement where a portion of his remaining assets and a share of any future proceeds from the 680 acres still in the family would be structured to account for what the North 40 had actually been worth. A number we all agreed on after months of careful accounting, rather than the discounted price Kurt Neubauer had walked away with. The final agreement, drawn up over nearly 4 months of careful negotiation between Bonnie Halverson and Wade's own attorney, set the adjusted value of the North 40 at $660,000. Based on 2 independent appraisals, Bonnie insisted on commissioning and structured a repayment against Wade's future share of farm proceeds until the gap between that figure and what Kurt Neubauer had actually paid was accounted for in full. It wasn't a fortune returned overnight, and I never expected it to be. It was closer to $12,000 a year coming off Wade's share for the foreseeable future, a slow accounting rather than a single satisfying number. But Bonnie was right, that the slowness of it mattered almost as much as the total, because it meant Wade couldn't simply write an apology and move on from it. It meant every October, when the checks went out the way they always had, there would be a quiet, ongoing reminder built into the arrangement itself. Wade sold his house in Sioux Falls 8 months later, a smaller sacrifice than the one he'd handed away without asking, and moved into a modest place 15 miles from the farm, closer than he'd lived to that ground in over 30 years. He started coming out on weekends, not to farm, because that was never going to be his calling any more than it had been 30 years earlier, but to help where he actually could, keeping books alongside Gerald Pruitt, handling equipment paperwork, small things, honest things, done without being asked. Deanne, for her part, called me directly a few weeks after the agreement was finalized, her voice carrying an exhaustion I recognized from my own months of processing all of this. I didn't know about most of it either, Dale. The loan, the timing, any of it. I want you to know that, and I want you to know I'm as angry with him as you have every right to be. We're working through our own version of this at home, and it isn't easy. I told her I believed her, and I meant it, because whatever else Wade had done, I never once saw a reason to let it poison the one part of his life that had had nothing to do with any of it. Word travels fast in a county the size of ours, and I ran into an old family friend, a retired school teacher and longtime neighbor named Dolores Fenn, at the co-op in Phillip a few weeks after the agreement with Wade was finalized. She'd taught both Wade and me back in the 60s, and she'd known my parents since before either brother was born. Dale, I heard some of what happened with the North 40, she said, setting a hand on my arm the way she used to when we were boys who'd skinned a knee. I want you to know, your father talked about that well more than almost anything else on that whole place. Told me once, must have been 20 years ago, that a man could lose every other acre he owned and still count himself lucky as long as that well kept running. I'm sorry it ended up the way it did. I hadn't expected to hear my father's own words handed back to me by someone outside the family, and it settled something in me the same way it settled something the day I'd finally sat with Wade and heard him admit the truth of it plainly. Grief, I've come to understand, sometimes needs an outside witness before it can finish the shape it's supposed to take. Kurt Neubauer, for his part, never once reached out to acknowledge any of it, and I've made my peace with the fact that some men never do. I see his cattle on that North 40 most mornings still, when I drive out to the eastern fence line, though the fence line itself, the part that's still mine, is close enough that I can still see the cottonwoods my mother planted, still see the flat gray stone marking the spot where my parents' ashes went into ground they'd cleared with their own hands. I don't own that specific patch of grass anymore. I've had to learn that owning it was never really the whole point of any of this. Last month, Wade drove out on a Saturday morning before sunrise, something he hadn't done since we were boys, and found me already sitting on the tailgate with my coffee and Josie's dog, watching the light come up slow over the fence line. "Room for one more?" he asked, and I moved over without saying much of anything, and we sat there together, the two of us, watching the sun climb the way it had every single morning of our whole lives, whether either one of us was paying attention to it or not. "I think about Dad a lot out here," Wade said eventually. "Wondering what he'd have thought of all this. He'd have been disappointed in how it happened," I said honestly. "But I think he'd have wanted us sitting here together at the end of it, more than he'd have wanted either one of us still angry." We sat there a long while longer, not saying much else, because some conversations don't need many more words once the important ones have finally been spoken honestly. Josie came home this past summer between semesters and spent 6 full weeks working the operation alongside me, up before 4 most mornings, the same as I'd been doing my whole life. And one evening near the end of her stay, she asked if she could come sit with me and Scout at the eastern fence line the next morning instead of sleeping in. She was there before I was, actually, sitting on the tailgate with her own thermos when I pulled up, and we watched the sun come up together in a silence that felt like it belonged to both of us equally. "I talked to Uncle Wade last week," she said eventually. "He asked me what I actually wanted to do with my degree once I finish. I think he meant it as more than small talk. He's trying," I told her, slowly and later than he should have started, but he's trying. We held a small gathering at the farm this past October, nothing like a wedding or any kind of formal occasion, just the annual harvest supper Carol and I have hosted every year for over 2 decades. Tables set up in the yard, half the families along our stretch of road stopping by through the afternoon the way they always have. Wade came, without Diane that particular year since she'd stayed behind with a cold, and spent most of the afternoon helping Gerald Pruitt and me square away the last of the fall paperwork at the kitchen table instead of socializing much, which felt, oddly, like exactly the right kind of presence for where things stood between us. Dolores Fenn came too, and found her way over to where Wade was sitting at one point, and I watched the two of them talk for a long while, though I never asked either one what was said. Toward the end of that afternoon, Wade found me near the old barn, the same one where our father had died 11 years earlier, and stood beside me quietly for a moment before speaking. I used to think leaving this place was the smart choice, he said. Sioux Falls, the insurance career, all of it. I still don't regret leaving. Exactly. But I think I spent 30 years telling myself this ground didn't mean anything to me, so that it wouldn't hurt as much when I finally did something like what I did to you. Did it work? I asked. Not hurting, I mean, no, Wade said, not even close. I didn't have anything clever to say back to that, so I just put my hand on his shoulder, the way our father used to do to both of us, when we were boys too young, yet to understand half of what he was trying to teach us, and we stood there together a while longer, watching the last of the harvest supper guests make their way back to their trucks in the fading light. I've come to understand something in the year since that text message arrived. While I was still strapped to a hospital monitor, something I don't think I could have understood without going through every ugly layer of it first. A piece of land can hold a family's whole history inside it. The wells and the trees and the exact spot where the people you loved most became part of the ground itself. And losing a piece of that history to betrayal is a wound that doesn't close just because the people involved eventually find their way back to something like honesty. But I've also learned that the ground itself was never really the whole inheritance. What we actually inherit from people like my father is the willingness to keep showing up, plainly and without hiding, even after we've done the thing that made showing up the hardest choice available to us. If this story reminds you of ground or trust that's ever been taken from you by someone who should have protected it instead, maybe it's worth asking yourself honestly what you actually want out of the reckoning that follows, before a text message from a stranger forces that question on you the way it did for me. And if this one stayed with you, share it with someone who's ever had to learn the hard way what family actually costs. And subscribe for more true stories about land, inheritance, and the people who finally learned to earn back what they almost lost for good.